Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 28 of the American Pageant, titled Progressivism and the Republican Roosevelt, from 1901 to 1912. As always, we're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or a later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, the content's going to be the same. So to start off, let's talk about key concepts, or rather lack thereof. As I mentioned in my last video, the last chapter, I'm not going to be putting in key concepts anymore because I think it's copyrighted material from the textbook and I don't want to get in trouble for that, so I'm just going to avoid it completely. But you can always reference the key concepts, which are usually located at the beginning of every chapter in your textbook. So if you want to reference that to help sort of organize your information, which I highly recommend you do, you can find it there. So to start off, let's talk about progressivism, what it is as a movement, what it stood for, who was behind it, all of that. And really you should note that during this time, with the rise of progressivism, there is also a rise in urban poverty, cities, industrialization, immigration, racial inequality, crime, and disease. So as we see this rise in the progressivist movement, the world is not doing so well, or at least the US is not doing so well. So really, the key question behind this entire movement is, should the federal government continue to have limited powers, or should it become more active in order to resolve the problems of the modern world, shape society, and protect American interests abroad? And this question is really the center of progressivism. Progressivism basically demonstrated the need for reform, which was the first attempt at evaluating the role of government. What is the government morally obligated to do, and what can we handle ourselves? They also wanted to limit the power of monopolies and improve the general public's working and living conditions. So there's no more laissez-faire policy, and the government is going to finally take action to protect the consumer and get rid of corruption. So in other words, the government is like, we see you, we're going to help you, which has been ignored for many decades. So this is definitely a step in the right direction. And this all really starts with the muckrakers. This was a derogatory name, actually, given by President Roosevelt to the reporters who exposed problems in society in order to encourage reform. They often targeted corruption between big business and government, and in general social injustices. So the goal of the muckrakers and the progressivist movement as a whole was to improve capitalism, not get rid of it. They were not socialists or communists. They weren't going towards more radical ideas, but rather improving the system that's already in place. So really, they're just sort of like digging for dirt on the US. They want to sort of expose all of these problems and show the government that this is not acceptable and that people are genuinely suffering. Some important muckrakers you should know about: Ida Tarbell. She exposed the corruption of Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. You have Jacob Riis, who described the horrors of New York slums. Another one you should know about is Thorstein Veblen. He said that the elite class was actually making wasteful business. In other words, making money just for the sake of becoming richer, instead of actually doing like productive activities like making goods that satisfy real needs. And finally, you have Ray Stannard Baker. He described how many African Americans were still illiterate and often subject to racial violence. So all of these people, and many more that I haven't included, it's in the textbook if you want more information, but these are really the four important ones, at least, that I took away from the textbook. So these are really just showing you the different types of problems that people are facing and that muckrakers are going to expose. And during this time, we're also going to see the rise in a movement known as the social gospel. So while all of these horrible things were happening, from poverty to racial inequality, crime, disease, the wealthy are now starting to feel morally and even religiously obligated to help the poor for the advancement of civilization. So they believe that progressivism was based on Christian teachings and morals. So because of all of this, wealthy people began to donate to schools, and this leads to an increased quality of education, which further spurs reform. And because of these movements, we're going to see a lot of laws and other political initiatives passed in order to further the ideals of progressivism. And fair warning, this slide is very content heavy, so bear with me for a minute. But first, let's start off with Muller versus Oregon in 1908. This was a Supreme Court case that said laws restricting women to 10-hour workdays were actually constitutional. And this is seen as a victory because it contradicted the norm of employers controlling everything and gave more, like, quote-unquote protections to women workers, who were seen as more fragile and more weak to keep up with the demands of industry. So although this is a setback for the feminist movement, it was considered a victory for the labor movement because employees are finally getting like more protections, they are actually cared about, and they're not overworked in these horrible conditions. And And one thing to note about the progressive movement was that it was a very diverse group of people who had various motives for reforms. So for example, pacifists wanted to abolish war, settlement house workers wanted to assimilate immigrants so that they could lead better lives, labor unionists wanted greater government regulation to prevent against worker exploitation and trusts and just general corruption, and women wanted suffrage, and this was justified because they said that they were, really involved in the House, and it was actually an extension of their traditional homemaking capacities to be able to vote, not a rejection. Because the idea that a woman could vote was generally seen as, giving them too much power. It was sort of like a man's thing. And women are trying to make their case by saying, look, we spend all of our time in the house. We know what children need. We know what the house and society needs. So we are qualified to vote on issues important to us and vote responsibly for them, which will definitely help make their case. And in terms of progressive measures, I like to talk about them in terms of categories. So this category is political reforms, and it's really aiming to undercut the power of political party bosses. So for example, you have the initiative where voters could directly propose legislation, so they could completely bypass the state legislatures. I don't know why it says bypassing, but I mean bypass, get away from. And these were state legislatures which party bosses tended to have a stronghold over. So by sort of letting voters directly propose legislation, they have a lot more power. You have the referendum, which said that laws could be placed on the ballot and would have to be approved by the people to pass. So this made it more difficult for big business agents to railroad in laws that benefited them. If it didn't help the people, obviously they wouldn't pass it, and this is sort of like a checks and balance system against corruption and trust, and all of these things that can make companies have a monopoly over a certain industry. You also have the recall, where elected officials who had accepted bribes from big business or lobbyists could be removed by the people. In other words, they could be recalled, like a product is recalled because it's faulty. Same thing with elected officials. So this means that there's less opportunity for corruption in government. You have the Australian ballot, which said voters could secretly mark their choice when voting and don't have to feel intimidated into choosing certain candidates. So they had the privacy of, being the only person who knew who they voted for. They can't be intimidated into choosing a certain person at the polls, and this further just made sure that, true values that people had were represented in their ballots. You have the 17th Amendment, which allowed for the direct election of senators by the people. So this again reduces the power of the party bosses and weakens the link between big business and government. It's all about the people. And finally, you should know about Wisconsin's governor, Robert La Follette. He essentially took control away from these corrupt companies and devised a system to regulate public utilities. So with all of these political reforms, we're seeing that more power is going to the people. People are just more in control of what happens in society. Some other things you should know about regarding progressivism. For one, you have the Supreme Court case Lochner versus New York in 1905. This was a New York state law that had established a 10-hour workday for bakers, but the court invalidates the law, and this is seen as a setback for the labor movement and shows that progressivism wasn't always successful. So essentially, they were trying to sort of limit the number of hours a baker could work because it would prevent them from being overworked and exploited by their employers, but it wasn't successful and the court invalidated the law. And this is really, showing you a very important concept, which you'll probably have to evaluate in a DBQ, LEQ, one of those things, which is how effective was progressivism? How efficient was it in achieving its goals? Did it achieve its goals? So this is definitely something you should think about. You should also know about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. This happened when a fire erupted in this factory, mostly a factory where women worked, but the locked doors and other fire code violations prevented the workers from escaping, and many either jumped out of the building or burned to death. So this leads to a lot of workers' compensation laws, like if you're hurt by your employer, you are eligible to receive compensation for your loss and your trauma and all of that. And this is really just saying, to corporations and to employers, you have to follow the rules or there will be consequences. So now it's a lot more difficult for employers to take advantage of their workers. They're going to be very careful about it because they actually have consequences that they have to consider. Back when this wasn't a thing, they could exploit the workers and the workers would protest, sure, but they would have backup workers and it wouldn't really be a big deal and they wouldn't really address the root issue of it. But now, when they actually could face consequences, severe consequences, for this. Obviously, they don't want to pay fines and whatever, so they're going to actually follow the rules a bit more strictly. And during this time, Roosevelt will become very well known for the Square Deal, and this was essentially his attempt to address the 3 Cs, as he called them, by passing acts to reform corrupt corporations, protecting consumers, and conserving the environment. These were all very progressive ideals and goals, and he becomes very well known for trust busting, as we'll see with sort of all of his acts and reform. And you can see that Roosevelt is not like the other presidents with the coal strike of 1902. So these coal workers decide to go on strike, they want more pay and less working hours, and instead of sending in troops to suppress the rebellion, Roosevelt actually threatens to shut down the mine if the owners don't give in to their demands. So for once, the president is actually siding with labor instead of protecting business interests. This is new and this is an amazing change. It shows that the government actually cares about the often forgotten people. So clearly the progressivism movement is making some impact on society. But more specifically, let's talk about how Roosevelt started controlling companies and really just making sure that there wasn't any corruption, or at least preventing corruption as much as possible, and ensuring that consumer interests were put first. So you have the Elkins Act of 1903. This said that railroad companies who gave rebates to companies so that these companies would prefer to use their rail line, and shippers who accepted the bribes would be punished. And this allowed for competitive railroad rates, which meant there was no monopoly. You also have the Hepburn Act of 1906. This banned free passes, where basically the railroad would give companies free rides in the hopes of future business. So that's not allowed anymore. And finally, you have the Northern Securities case of 1902. So this railroad company had tried to monopolize the industry in the Northwest, but Roosevelt breaks down the trust. And for the first time, antitrust legislation is actually used to break up a trust instead of a labor union. So if you remember, back when there were, actual antitrust laws passed, they basically said anything that prevents trade from happening, or like stops trade, is a trust or can be prosecuted. And so those laws would be used against labor unions when they went on strike, because technically they were stopping trade. They weren't working, so they weren't producing product, and these laws actually hurt labor unions. So for once, in this very monumental case, we're seeing that the laws are actually used as they're intended. Roosevelt was also known for consumer protections, and this really starts when Upton Sinclair writes The Jungle in 1906. This described the unsanitary working conditions of meat workers, and it hoped to incite sympathy for their plight, but it actually made people more concerned about the cleanliness of the meat they were eating. So although that wasn't the original point of the book, it definitely was something that needed to be addressed, so in some ways it did serve its purpose. And so as a result of this book, the Meat Inspection Act is passed in 1906. It said the federal government could regulate and inspect the meat industry, and it shows that the government actually cares about public concerns, so there's no more laissez-faire. You should also know about the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. This was essentially created because people were worried that they were being sold mislabeled food and drugs. They wanted to make sure that they weren't allergic to anything in their food, and just be notified about what's in it. And so the FDA is created to regulate the labels so that consumers are more informed. And overall, again, you're just seeing that there's more government regulation of business to ensure no malpractice. And finally, let's talk about the last C of Roosevelt's Square Deal, which was conserving the environment. And this really starts with the Hetch Hetchy Valley controversy, which arises when preservationists want to leave the valley as it is, but conservationists want to protect it while also using it efficiently and responsibly. And so ultimately, conservationists win, a dam is built, preservationists are super upset, but companies will find ways to work with the federal government over the preservation of natural resources. A lot of people don't really want to leave land just as it is because they feel like it's unused potential. There is something that they can do with it. And debate will continue as to, what extent should the nation protect and use nature? What becomes too much, an exploitation of nature? So that's definitely a conversation that's going to continue because of this controversy. So conservationists have won this time. They're basically telling preservationists to sort of let it go because it's using land, and it's not completely irresponsibly, although later on it will become irresponsible. But at the moment, it's used for good purposes and intents, so they don't really see the preservationist side of the argument. And finally, not really related to progressivism, but you should definitely know about the election of 1908. The Republicans choose to nominate William Taft, who was Roosevelt's Secretary of War, while the Democrats choose William Jennings Bryan. And Taft wins the election, which will sort of be a continuation of Roosevelt's presidency, as we'll see, but it will definitely be different in many regards. And last but not least, let's talk about Taft and a little bit about Wilson, who will be the next president after Taft. But in regards to Taft, he is not really going to do much. I mean, he definitely does a lot more trust busting than Roosevelt did. Roosevelt sort of becomes known for trust busting more than Taft did, but Taft was actually the one who did more of that stuff. But aside from that, he did use dollar diplomacy, which supported U.S. investments abroad in areas that were strategically significant. So, for example, near Central America to ensure the security of the Panama Canal, and this further strengthened foreign policy and defense, which allowed for greater profits. So overall, they're essentially just using money to ensure that their interests are protected in places where they can't physically be present. Aside from dollar diplomacy, Taft is really well known for the Payne-Aldrich Bill in 1909, and for a little bit of context, just remember that progressives in the Republican Party wanted to lower the protective tariff because it would prevent monopolies. So remember, when there's a higher tariff, it's more difficult for foreign products to come into the country, which means that domestic companies have less competition, and they aren't required to make a specifically good product, they don't have to be competitive with their prices, and people are sort of forced to buy this mediocre product. And with all of this in mind, Taft actually really angers the progressives in the Republican Party because the bill keeps high rates on the most used imports, but he thinks it's a perfectly fine bill. So really, it does nothing to lower the tariff, and it actually kind of, makes it worse. Aside from that, you should know about the Ballinger-Pinchot quarrel, where Taft fires the well-liked conservationist for insubordination, further splitting the Republican Party. So he is, in many regards, a very divisive person. And all of this leads us to the election of 1912. I think this is one of the more important elections in general throughout APUSH, so this is definitely one you should know about. In regards to the candidates, the Democrats choose Woodrow Wilson, Republicans choose Roosevelt again, and he actually wants to challenge Taft for the nomination because he felt like Taft hadn't really followed his policies, that he had expected that Taft would be an extension of Roosevelt, but in reality, it wasn't really what he wanted. So Roosevelt decides to sort of challenge him again. And then there's the socialist Eugene Debs, who was known for organizing many labor protests. And during the election, Roosevelt is going to run on the New Nationalism platform. And this was essentially a comprehensive and very progressive platform in order to gain support from many different groups, and it advocated mostly for strict regulatory agencies, so it's not as free function as Wilson's platform is going to be, as I'll talk about in a minute, and it doesn't really gain much support. And Wilson runs on the New Freedom platform. So this essentially called for unmonopolized and unregulated markets, and it was only really going to be controlled by antitrust laws, banking reforms, and tariff reductions. And this is very popular among the public, and it helps Wilson win the election of 1912. So essentially, they're taking measures that increase competition instead of government regulation, which is very appealing to many people. And that does it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how I got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions. Please be sure to like, subscribe, all of that, you know the drill. And yeah, see you in the next chapter.